Well, it's very opportune that Liberate the Debate has organised this discussion today, the very day that the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, outlined Labour's proposals to move towards greater economic democracy. As you know, the Shadow Chancellor is proposing two main things. The first of all, the idea that employee and consumer representatives should have mandatory places on the boards of big corporations. And secondly, that private companies should be required by law to issue share ownership to their employees, to give their employees a stake in their companies. My question is, why should employee and consumer representatives on the board be restricted to private enterprises? Why not public institutions as well? Why shouldn't there be a mandatory requirement to have consumers and employee representatives on the boards of the National Health Service, or local councils, and other public institutions? So anyway, what I'd like to do is perhaps just move into those areas, but to begin by saying that essentially Britain today is an economic dictatorship. We have one person, one vote in the political system. We expect political democracy. Why not economic democracy as well? Why should there be this huge disjunction between the way in which the political system operates and the way the economic system operates? So when it comes to general elections, it's one person, one vote. If you're rich or you're poor, everybody has one vote. Now, our system is far from perfect. We have first past the post, which worked very well under a two-party system, but is totally dysfunctional under a multi-party system like we have today. It is monstrous that since 1931, no governing party in Britain has ever won a majority of the popular vote. Every single government since 1931 has been a government based on minority public support. That includes Margaret Thatcher's landslide of 1983 and Tony Blair's landslide in 1997. In both instances, they won about 43% of the vote. Clearly not a majority, yet they had a huge majority of seats in Parliament. So the political system is flawed, but the basic principle of one person, one vote applies. That is not the case in the economic system. In the economic system, very rich people, the major shareholders, directors and managers, they have all the votes. They decide how an institution, an enterprise, a corporation operates. The employees, without whom no wealth could be created, have no votes, no say. They're excluded from decision-making, including investment, pricing, jobs, you name it. They have no say. Now, that is not consistent with the democratic ethos of modern 21st century Britain. We need to change that. And what I'd like to propose is a series of suggestions about how we could move towards greater economic democracy, transparency, and accountability. And they're just 3 or 4 basic ideas. The first one is to say that all professionals, solicitors, doctors, and so on, they have a code of conduct, and if they violate it, they can face disciplinary action and even legal action. So a doctor who fails in his or her duty of care to a patient can be held liable by the General Medical Council and can be sued in a court of law. But there is no such professional code of conduct or control when it comes to business. Business people are a law unto themselves. So my first suggestion would be to create a new offence of corporate negligence, neglect, and irresponsibility, where a manager or director or a board of directors can be shown to have acted in a reckless and negligent way, they should be held personally liable. The company shouldn't be held liable because that can just be absorbed as a cost to the company. The individuals should be held personally liable in the same way as an individual doctor or solicitor can be held personally liable. Now, if you think about it, if this criminal offence existed, say 20 years ago, you can almost certainly guarantee that the directors of Northern Rock and RBS would have not taken the reckless, irresponsible investment decisions they did, which plunged this country into an economic recession and nearly tipped the world, with other countries involved, into a global Great Depression. If they had known that they would have been personally financially liable for the losses and could face imprisonment, they would have been much more cautious and careful about those reckless decisions. I don't believe they would have made them. I believe if they knew they had personal liability, they would have acted differently, and that would have saved us from the economic crisis that this country befell in 2007 and 2008. So to me, it's a very simple request. Now, of course, for those of you who know your law, under the Fraud Act of 2006, they should have been held liable anyway, because even though the Fraud Act of 2006 is rather weak, it did have clauses that could have prosecuted, for example, Fred Goodwin of RBS and other directors. But deliberately and consciously, the then financial authority declined to act. And in fact, even when the Treasury Committee of the House of Commons demanded the handover of files, the Financial Conduct Authority refused to supply them, claiming corporate confidentiality. A deliberate attempt to hide the direct personal responsibility of the heads of RBS and Northern Rock. So all I'm saying is, clearly the Fraud Act was not good enough. We need a stronger, more powerful legislation to ensure corporate responsibility. The second point, which very much dovetails with what John McDonnell is proposing, is that all medium and large-sized companies, including public institutions like the National Health Service, should be required by law to have at least 1/3 employee-elected directors and independent consumer directors appointed to their boards to represent the interests of staff and consumers. This is not a big ask. It is, to me, obvious that public and private institutions that wield great power should be accountable to the people who work in them and accountable to the people who receive their goods and their services. It's not saying that they should be totally under the control of staff and consumers, but certainly having that input from the shop floor and from consumers, I think would be a very helpful safeguard against bad policies. So look at the example of the German Works Council method. In Germany, for decades, they've had a Works Council where employee representatives, usually elected through trade unions, sit on management boards together with representatives of the directors, the shareholders, and so on. Everybody agrees that Germany has better industrial relations and higher productivity than compared to Britain. And one of the reasons is because when there is a grievance, employees can take that grievance directly to the top management board. And often, not always, but often or usually, those grievances are resolved at that level without the employees needing to go on strike or go slow. So fewer strikes, better industrial relations, higher productivity, better profitability. So even from a business sense, this makes sense. Even from a business sense, it's fairer and better all round. Because if we have better industrial relations and higher productivity, that not only benefits the company concerned, it's also good for the economy as a whole. Obviously, if you have employee and consumer representatives on the board with full knowledge of corporate work goings on, with the ability to speak and to vote, then clearly if things are going wrong, they can challenge that. And if the issue is not resolved within the board, they can go public and blow the whistle. So imagine if there were employee and consumer representatives on the boards of RBS and Northern Rock back in 2005, 2006. They would have seen the reckless, irresponsible gambling being pursued by RBS. They could have raised that at the management board level, and if that hadn't been resolved satisfactorily, they could have gone to the media and alerted the public and the government to the recklessness of those directors. Also, of course, if you've got employee and consumer representatives on the board, they will obviously want to have, a profitable company, because that's how they get their wages paid. But they'll probably also be concerned about other issues like the environmental and social impact of the policies of that company. They're probably also more concerned about health and safety. So they'll raise lots of issues that aren't directly related to maximizing profit. And again, in the end, a responsible company tends to be ultimately a more profitable one, as well as one that's fairer to its staff and better for the wider public. Another idea is that to break up the very unhealthy concentration and centralization of economic power, there's a very strong case for saying that employee mutual societies should be established to give their members control of their pension funds. That would help decentralize and democratize investment decision-making. Right now, about a third of the entire stock market is based on investment from pension funds. 1/3. That's a huge weight of capital power. It's currently being used by the big insurance companies and pension funds in a way that suits them. As an ancillary, it often suits the members as well, but not necessarily. I would suggest that if employee mutual societies had control of their own pension funds, obviously they would employ financial experts to make the decisions, the wise decisions that they require, but they would do so within a framework decided by the members. So the members might decide, we don't want to invest in the arms trade. We don't want to invest in sweatshop labor in developing countries. And that could make for more socially responsible investment. They may also decide, if, say, they're in Cornwall or the Northeast or parts of Wales, they might decide, we want our members' pension funds invested in our own local community and region. Rather than sending the money to London or to Latin America or India or the North America, they might decide, we want to make the conscious choice to invest this pension fund in the local community and region so that we can directly benefit our communities. And that would be a very important consideration for many people who have been through the process of deindustrialization and the flight of capital from away from their regions towards London and the southeast. They may also decide they want to invest in more socially responsible projects like new medical technologies, renewable energy, affordable housing. There's a whole host of things that these employee mutual societies might choose to preference over orthodox targets for investment. And to some extent, they may get a slightly lower rate of return. Although if you look at some of the Scandinavian countries where similar schemes exist, the actual rate of return has been better than the British average. But even assuming that there might be a slightly diminished return, if it uplifts the whole community or the region, if it helps regenerate neglected parts of the country like Cornwall and Devon, that would be fantastic. Because those people in those regions would benefit from higher rates of employment, which would mean an incentive for more jobs locally, which would improve local tax receipts, which could therefore lead to the funding of better local services. So there's a whole knock-on effect which may not be directly translatable in terms of strict rate of return on a pension fund. A final example I'd give is, again, this is an idea that John McDonnell, the Labour Shadow Chancellor, has suggested, the idea of giving employees share ownership. He seems to be suggesting that large companies with 250 or more employees should be required to issue 10% new shares and give them collectively to the employees in a business. Well, that's one way of doing it. I've got a slightly different way, but I think the principle is right. Without employees, there can be no wealth creation. Without employees, the health service, local authorities, and so on simply do not function. So it's right, therefore, that those employees share in the wealth created or share in the success of a public institution. So my suggestion would be that there should be employee share ownership schemes collectively held and administered by all the staff in employee mutual societies. That is, societies owned and run by the employees under their control and direction. But what I'm suggesting is that private share capital companies should be obliged to issue to these mutual societies a proportion of their annual profits in the form of a new share issue. So I'm not saying that share issue should happen automatically. It should be based on increased profits or share of profits. So the great strength of this proposal is that not only it's democratic and accountable and has social justice at its core, but it also incentivizes and rewards employees for economic success. So the more productive and profitable a company is, the more shares it would be required to issue to employee mutual societies. And the sooner they would gain a significant boardroom influence through their share ownership. Now again, this is actually a scheme or idea that makes business sense as well as social justice sense, because it would encourage and reward employees for increased productivity. So they would gain, their firms would gain, and the whole economy would gain. We'd have a more productive economy, which would be a win-win for everyone. So what I'm suggesting by these 4 proposals is that it would help redistribute economic power in favor of employees and the wider public. It would increase transparency and accountability. It would give consumers and employees a stake in public and private institutions, and thereby reduce the likelihood of a rerun of the economic crisis of 2007-2008, and also help boost our economy overall. It's about decentralizing economic power, democratizing economic decision-making, improving corporate social responsibility, and strengthening the accountability of businesses to their employees and consumers. That is a complete sea change from the way in which the economy currently functions. Now, I don't pretend for one moment that I've got all the ideas. There are minds far greater than mine that will perhaps tweak and fine-tune these ideas and even come up with better ones. But what I'm saying is, what we've got isn't the only option. There are alternatives. And these ideas, I believe, are both radical and practical. They're a way to reconfigure the economy that will ensure greater democratic accountability and greater social justice, plus overall greater economic success and prosperity. So my question is not why, but why not? Thank you.
Right. Thank you. That was a really, really compelling speech and really, really interesting. I was curious when you were saying appointing employees and consumers to be part of these organisations. I was curious about how would that come into place? How would people be appointed into these positions? Because the biggest problem with corporations and organisations is that these are all private, but how do you make the public appointments not private? Is there an independent board that accounts for this, or is there something broader, or is it independent, I guess?
Well, in terms of employee representatives on the board, the way I see it, there will be a vote of all the staff conducted by the Electoral Reform Society, so it's completely independent and transparent, where employees would vote for their representatives. And that might be a vote every 1, 2 or 5 years, depending on what tenure you wanted to give these people. But also with the important caveat that if X number, maybe 30% of employees felt that their representative was not doing the job, they could have a recall ballot to get rid of them and replace them. Then when it comes to consumers, the only practical way of doing it, it's not very satisfactory, but it's better than nothing, would be to have some independent board which would be set up to establish short lists of candidates for particular industries or particular public institutions. People who were consumer representatives, either consumers themselves or representatives of, for example, like the Patients Association. It'd be very good to have someone from the Patients Association on the boards of all the NHS trusts. So that's the way I'd see it going. Yeah.
I guess the only other thing was I'm doing this more as like a devil's advocate sort of thing. With consumers and stuff, the argument, I guess, say in the instance of the NHS would be, surely the people that who should be making the decisions are the experts on these issues. So say, for instance, nurses or doctors, as opposed to patients who may not be fully aware of the functionings of what happens on the NHS on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I work for the NHS right now, so I know. I'm not pretending to know anything about it, but one of the biggest problems is the communication between the nurses and doctors and the administrative staff on certain issues. And I'm curious how the addition of consumers and patients would affect that dynamic.
Well, obviously there are some decisions in the NHS that can only be taken by experts in medical technologies and so on. But I'll just give you one example. My local hospital is St Thomas's, and until recently they had a very inefficient appointment system. And I used to complain about it, and the staff said, we totally agree this system is bonkers, but we don't have any say. We can't go to they actually said to me, we can't go to the trust management board because we don't have representation there. If we did, we would go and we'd explain to them, this system is dysfunctional. Now, eventually, after a lot of lobbying by staff and supported by some patients, St Thomas's have changed or improved their appointment system. which used to lead to incredible long waits, which was bad for staff and bad for patients. So there's a practical example of how patient input might work. Yeah.
Again, I'd just like to thank you so much for coming here to the University of Sussex. I'd like to play a bit of devil's advocate regarding the corporate negligence point, where it's not the business or the company as a whole that would be held accountable, but instead the individual. So playing devil's advocate for them, what they would say is that the free market is very cutthroat, that they're expected to be taking risks, and that if they don't take these risks, then they'll just be fired, they'll lose their job, their livelihood. So what I'm thinking for them is take risks, then if it goes badly, the government is going to prosecute them. So they'll be in trouble. If they don't take risks, then the bank is going to simply kick them off, so they won't be earning any money. So I think one of the issues with this is that then in the future, nobody will want that position, because for them, they'll see it as a lose-lose. So couldn't that cause another sort of economic crisis, where instead of the sudden one in 2007 and 2008, but an economic crisis over long term where there's a brain drain?
Well, you're right, but there are risks and there are risks. There's what you might call reasonable risks, risks where I suppose you've got a 60-40 chance of success. And then there's risks where you've got a 20 to 80% risk of failure. So, if you're gambling in a very high risk situation where the chances of success are low and the risk of failure is high, then I'd say that is probably not a good way to proceed. And indeed, in most circumstances, most companies would not proceed along those lines. They would recognize that where there's a significant risk of failure, that they should act in a more cautious and careful way. But clearly, you're right, in this cutthroat, free market system, there is an incentive or a pressure to take all kinds of risks. Well, I'm not against risk-taking, but when it becomes so reckless and so irresponsible, where the risk of failure is so high, then I do think that we need to have checks and balances to pressure people in power in corporations to not take those risks. And even if it means, perhaps a slightly diminished return, that's a price worth paying to have a more stable economy, where you have, yes, you may have fewer highs, but also fewer lows. But if it's more stable across the board on average, I'm sure that's better. I mean, I saw some lecture on TV or something about investment decisions, and they were saying, should you put your money into this company or that company? And someone was saying, well, this company, it's got a fairly low rate of return, but it's very stable and very secure, and you can be pretty much guaranteed you're going to get your 3%. Whereas you put it in this company, well, last year they did very, very well. They got a 13% return, but 5 years ago they got a 26% loss. So I think, we have to get away from this, troughs and peaks mentality and think about long-term stability and success. And I do think it's very important to have personal liability, because otherwise, what these big corporations always do is they say, well, the company will, if we make a mistake, the company will pick up the tab. And so there's no incentive for them to act in a cautious, careful, accountable way. So, for example, when the water companies or other utilities have big failures, that is absorbed by the company and passed on in terms of higher cost to customers. But it shouldn't be like that. The people who made the bad decisions, and I'm not saying just because you make a mistake you should automatically get done for this. I'm saying when there's serious evidence that you should have known about the risks being very high, and that the backup along the supply chain was unstable, when you go down that road, then you should pay the penalty.
Thanks very much for coming. On employee representation, you talked about the Fraud Act not working and talked about just now about lack of incentives for good decision making. If you do put employees on the board, wouldn't the power just corrupt them in the same way? Especially since as far as I see it, if one piece of legislation doesn't work, I don't see why another one would. And I think also, does it not depend on a case-by-case basis in terms of each industry? So if you're, say, RBS or Northern Rock, you know the government is going to bail you out if you get it wrong, and therefore you don't have and therefore you can afford to take the risk because you know the government's going to throw you a lifeline. So the same goes for rail, water, and all the utilities. So ultimately, is it a bit more? What's the word I'm looking for? A bit more broad than that. A bigger issue, as it were, than just a bit of legislation here and a bit of legislation there.
Well, a little bit of legislation here, a little bit there. It all adds up. It all acts as a constraint or as a caution to corporate decision making. You're right that in terms of public utilities, the government is the ultimate guarantor. But if the individuals themselves were also held personally liable, so for example, if Fred Goodwin of RBS lost his entire savings, his house, his yacht, his plane and everything else, if he knew those were up for grabs, he would have, I think, made very, very different decisions. And I think penalising individuals, possibly with terms of imprisonment as well, that's the way to go, because yes, the government will have to bail out in the end, but those individuals will also pay a heavy price. And the importance is not that they pay the price. We don't want that. We want them to be deterred from reckless, irresponsible decisions in the first place. And they'll only be deterred if they know that they can be held personally liable and, in extreme cases, face the prospect of jail.
So how effective do you think trial by media is? Because I think you'll agree we do have that at the moment, sort of trial by media. How effective is that at the moment, do you think? Because I do remember the whole thing about Goodwin's bonus back in 2012, and he was effectively pressurised into not taking it. So is that not a case of that working? Or?
Well, that works to a point, yeah. But we shouldn't have to rely on media pressure, useful though it often is. It'd be much better if we could rely upon shareholders, investors, representatives on the board making the decision, no, you're not going to get this bonus because you haven't fulfilled the obligations to this company and to the wider economy. You raised the point of bonuses, which is another issue I've also proposed, which I haven't addressed, but I will now briefly. I mean, why should bonuses only be paid to fat cats? Why should, billions of bonuses be paid every year to fat cats in the City of London? I think bonuses should be paid to grassroots employees. So, for example, if an employee in the health service can come up with an idea of saving money, say in procurement costs, I think they should get a bonus. Maybe 5% of the savings that they have identified and made possible. In a private company, if an employee can find a way of reconfiguring the production line that means greater productivity and efficiency and increased profits, they should also get a bonus in terms of the savings made. I think it's absolutely clear that grassroots employees, whether in public or private institutions, have a huge wealth of practical knowledge. A huge wealth of practical knowledge, which, if applied, could really help the economic efficiency of the enterprise or the public institution. So my father was a lathe operator in an engineering factory. And over 20 or 30 years, or he did it for like nearly 50 years, but over the first 20 or 30 years, I remember him saying, the way the production line works doesn't make sense. We should do it this way. Now, if his idea had been adopted, it wasn't, and his idea was also agreed and supported by other, production line workers, that company would have been more efficient. And I think, in those circumstances, the employees who come up with those ideas deserve bonuses.
Thank you for the talk. You talked quite a bit about the idea of capitalism being cutthroat and this very kind of violent system. But I wonder, have you ever been on the other side? Have you ever kind of thought about why such great intellects may have even thought of ideas which could be so abhorrent in a sense? And this is kind of just devil's advocate. I just wonder if maybe you've been on the other side, if you've seen the perspective or the values of the opposing side, and why they could, because at the moment you've presented a very, very clear solution to solving a lot of the issues that we have today. Why hasn't that come about earlier if it's so clear cut and easy?
Well, I think many of the great advocates of free enterprise and capitalism never intended some of the downsides and negative effects. I mean, if you read Adam Smith, Adam Smith also talks about social responsibility and corporate responsibility, and he conceived this idea of the free market system as being the one that would bring about the greatest happiness for the most people. So I think the intention was good, but just the way the system has historically worked has not produced the results which many of its advocates initially had aspired and hoped. So the problem is, of course, we don't have a clear example of a successful alternative. Most of them that have been tried have been under conditions of, command communism or quite tyrannical forms of socialism, which are, of course, not the kind of system we want. We want a system that is based on democracy, not the abrogation of it. And if you look at both the Soviet system and indeed British nationalised industries like the old coal industry, British Rail, British Telecom, when they're in public ownership, they were essentially run on orthodox capitalist lines. So if you'd been to a ball bearing factory in the Ukraine or Georgia or somewhere under the old Soviet Union, the managers had all the power, just like private capitalists. They were, in a sense, the agents of capital running that company on private corporate lines. Ostensibly, there was state ownership, but it was what many people would call state capitalism, capitalism under the aegis of the state. So what we're proposing, what I'm proposing here, is a completely different system. I know even what John McDonnell's trying to achieve is a completely different system of grassroots up. So not the old orthodox state or state socialist models, but more common ownership, common control.
Just as a small follow-up to that, and I know Adam Smith advocating those ideas, but what about modern economists who still believe the same things? Are they just ideologically driven, or are they have a good perspective as well, or are they just fearful of the system that could come about being too dangerous, because of past examples of communism not perhaps working, or socialism?
Well, in many ways, I think economics is one of the most conservative of all professions, all set of ideas. Orthodox economics, as it's taught and practiced in most countries, is very, very conservative with a small c. There are some economists who go out on a limb who've suggested alternatives, like mine or others, but they're very much in a minority. And this prevailing orthodoxy is what has strangled any attempts to really chart an alternative course. And I don't think these are bad people. I mean, some of them are ideologically driven. Some of them are driven by a reaction to and a fear of the kind of tyrannical state socialism that existed in places like China, the Soviet Union, and so on. And that's one perspective. And others are just driven by the fact that, economics is very conservative. I mean, when I studied economics and when I did my degree, the ideas we were talking about were all very, very within a very conservative, narrow framework. And I just think we need to look beyond that.
Thank you very much. Just to go back to you saying that you think it would be profitable and financially favourable for these companies to be more answerable to their employees and held accountable to how well they treat them. As a flip side to that, how do you think, because recently we've had two companies go over the value of $1 trillion, being Apple and Amazon. Amazon's sort of infamous for how horribly they treat their warehouse employees. And Apple's much better in terms of how they treat their Western employees, but they've obviously also had some controversies with their East Asian production lines and, suicide nets and stuff like that to stop their production workers jumping out the window. How do you think that both of the most valuable companies in existence have got to that point while being so far separated from their everyday workers. And do you think that they genuinely would be even more profitable if they were answerable to their employees? Or do you think it's just sort of a stranglehold they've got that's prevented the smaller and more in touch with their grassroots companies from rising up and challenging them?
Yeah, it's a moot point. If Amazon or any other big corporation was required to operate within these kinds of frameworks, it may be their profitability might go down. But since their profitability is so great, why not? I mean, profitability isn't the god, isn't the absolute criterion by which a company should be judged. And I think that by their ruthlessness, they are strangling the smaller companies who are trying to be more ethical and responsible, whether it be to their employees or to the environment or the community or whatever. So I think that it wouldn't be a bad thing at all if big companies like Amazon, Starbucks, and so on, Apple, had a reduction in their profits. They could easily absorb that. And that would help open the space for, or more likely open the space for other companies who do have good or better employment practices and consumer responsibility to get an edge in the market.
Okay, and if you sort of will somewhat concede that there might be a hit in profitability to the top-end companies, how would we, as a nation, prevent them from being based overseas and just having small sort of nodes to operate out of here and avoiding this regulation to maintain that edge that they might still keep? Because as much as you can say profitability isn't the god, to them it might be, and they might be willing to, bugger off.
Yeah. Well, that is undoubtedly true, and that's why these ideas are going to work most effectively if they're agreed at a European-wide level or at a global level. It's why the whole international economic debate and argument, the role of the G20, the IMF, and so on, has to be reconfigured to give a greater input into democratizing the way firms operate, holding them accountable, and doing so across borders. Now, that, of course, is a big ask because you have to get all these different countries to agree. But, for example, the European Parliament has agreed that there should be a Tobin tax, a financial transaction tax, on all currency, bond, and commodity transactions. Vetoed by Britain, by the Conservative government here. But there is a broad consensus on that one issue across the European Union in terms of the Parliament, perhaps not the Council of Ministers, but the Parliament, that the way to end austerity and fund public services, or one way, is to have a financial transaction tax. And we know that in this country alone, if there was a financial transaction tax on currency, shares, bonds, and commodities, it would raise between something like 50 to 100 billion pounds every single year, which could be used to invest in the health service, education, affordable housing, and so on. So, back to your point, getting a European or global consensus would make this much more effective. But even so, Britain is a big market. And even if only Britain and only a few other countries or a few other significant countries agree these kind of policies, that would be pretty powerful. That's a pretty big wedge of economic market that these companies would not want to lose.
Once again, thank you very much for your excellent speech. I wouldn't say it's controversial to say that trade unionism and indeed representation within the workplace isn't very popular right now. Not to say it's unpopular, but trade union membership is as low as it's ever been in history. Coming from a company that practices the sort of methods that you're proposing, Waitrose, which has a bonuses system and an employee representation system within the upper levels of the partnership, which didn't work particularly well. Indeed, the bonuses did, but the representation not so much. How exactly do we encourage the general public and indeed private employees in industries that historically have never been very well suited to representation, such as retail, where most people are now employed? How do we encourage people to be more active within business, to seek greater representation among their colleagues?
I think you're right that there is at least to some degree, a negative or not sympathetic perception towards trade unions, which is sad and tragic because so many of the gains that the employees have made over the decades have been the direct result of trade union action. People would still be, working 12 hours a day or, kids down mines if it wasn't for trade unions and others championing an end to that. So trade unions have been the motor, the vehicle for so many gains that ordinary people now take for granted. And the decline of trade unions coincides with, 0 hours contracts and all the other dodgy things that are going on in the economy. So we have to acknowledge that, and also, I think, acknowledge, and I say this as someone who supports trade unions, that the trade unions have not themselves been their best advocates, and that some of the things they've done have not helped their own reputation. So I'll just give you one example. This is going back a way, but it's a good example. In Australia in the 1970s, the trade unions went through a process of radical modernization. They had the same sense that, the older generation supported trade unions, but younger people didn't. So how could they make themselves more relevant and more popular? So one idea was they opened a trade union department store, which sold goods at, on the whole, lower prices than main stores did. So people saw trade unions through that department store as serving the public, as serving the consumer. The second thing some trade unions did was the building trade unions, construction workers in particular, adopted green policies against urban regeneration, which was decimating local communities. So particularly in the Sydney inner city area, the construction workers union refused to work on projects to build luxury flats and new offices while elbowing local working class communities out. So it not only preserved some fantastic, brilliant 19th century architecture, which was going to go to the bulldozer, but it also preserved those communities and ensured that that historic part of Sydney survived. And again, the public saw the trade unions as being the instrument of the public will, of defending the public, not just defending their own members, not just fighting over wages, but actually standing for what was morally and ethically and environmentally right. So I'd say that trade unions in this country need to learn those lessons, and they need to make themselves popular vehicles for the wider public as well as for their members. The second part of your question I've forgotten now.
I was just asking how we make public representation within companies themselves more popular.
Yeah. I think one of the problems with John Lewis in Waitrose is that it is a bit tokenistic. And I think a lot of the employees quite like that system, but it is really a bit of window dressing, if I may use that analogy. I think it's only when employees and consumers can see tangible power and influence and voting rights and so on that people really engage with these ideas.
Right, fantastic. Now on to the second motion. Free speech is under attack.
Thank you all very much. So many of you all know I'm a passionate defender of free speech. It is one of the most important of all human rights, and over the centuries, many people have suffered greatly to defend it. My big concern at the moment is the way in which some student unions, and I emphasize it's only some, are imposing overzealous restrictions on who can speak on campus and what they can say. Now, I say some. I mean, this has been grossly exaggerated. There was a poll and research done by Spiked Online which suggested that over 90% of student unions had restrictions on free speech. But when you actually looked at it, the restrictions in most cases were very minor. And in hardly any cases were people actually stopped from speaking. So we need to keep it in perspective. But what I would say is that it is very important that universities, among others, are places where ideas can be contested and debated, even controversial, provocative, and perhaps even bad ideas. But the way to defeat bigoted ideas or bad ideas is not by censorship, by bans, by exclusions. It's by defeating them through public scrutiny and by countering them with better ideas, backed by evidence, by logic, by ethics. So I'm not a great advocate in favour of no platforming and safe space policies, although in certain circumstances I agree they do have their place. What has alarmed me greatly is that in response to this hue and cry, this exaggerated hue and cry that free speech is being closed down at universities all over the country, which it's not, but in response the government has introduced a policy that now requires university authorities to indiscriminately clamp down on student bodies that for any reason no platform speakers or restrict them via safe space policy. So in other words, we've got a sledgehammer to crack a nut. The government has set up the newly created Office for Students. And under this proposal, he is empowered, the minister, university's minister, is empowered to fine, suspend, or deregister universities that fail to protect freedom of speech. Now, of course, we want universities to defend free speech, but this is a very draconian step. The idea that, for example, Sussex University could be fined, suspended, and deregistered as a university because of what some students in it may have done, that strikes me as monstrous. It's the mass penalisation of all students for perhaps some excesses by a handful. Under the new regulations, university authorities now have a legal duty to uphold free speech by staff, student unions, and student societies. This seems to me very unfair and unworkable. Why should the university authorities be held liable for what particular students do or staff do? I think that if there are breaches, then those individual student societies, student unions, or individual students should be held liable, not the whole university. As I said, in a free society, free speech is one of the most important of all human rights, and it depends upon the free exchange of ideas. And some of those ideas may be quite unpalatable, but I think the way to defeat them is by challenging them, not by suppressing them. Now, some students justify no platforms and safe spaces in the name of not causing offence. They say, we don't want to have this speaker, we have to have these rules because we don't want to cause offence. Well, almost every idea is potentially capable of causing offence to someone. So I think offence is not a legitimate criterion. And indeed, in no human rights law does it say you're not allowed to cause offence. I remember when I was campaigning for LGBT rights way back in the 70s and 80s, I was told you're causing great offence. Women who campaign against female genital mutilation are told you're causing great offence. Women who challenge other misogynistic and patriarchal practices are often rebuked, you're causing offence to religious people or, men, I just think that offence is not the right criterion. If we look at it, many of the most important ideas in human history, such as those of Galileo Galilei, Karl Marx, Charles Darwin, Sigmund Freud, Richard Dawkins, and many others, their ideas have caused great offence in their time. But I think we would be diminished as a society if we said that those ideas should not have been heard, that they should have been suppressed on the grounds that they caused offence. I mentioned some surveys. There was a survey 2 years ago which found that 63% of university students support the National Union of Students having a no-platform policy. Analysis published last year by Spiked Online found that, or claimed that, over 60% of universities actively censor speech and 30% plus stifle speech through excessive regulation. As I said, these statistics sound very alarming. But in most cases, the restrictions were very minor and did not, in fact, restrict the exchange of ideas. But that research was very pivotal in persuading the Conservative government to enact these new proposals through the Office for Students. The then university minister, Joe Johnson, was quoted as saying, quote, "Our young people and students need to accept the legitimacy of healthy, vigorous debate in which people can disagree with one another. That's how ideas get tested, prejudice is exposed, and society advances. Universities mustn't be places in which free speech is stifled." Now, I think his sentiments are in principle very laudable. But I think the plan, the solution, is ill thought out and oblivious to the potentially incendiary consequences. It is going to turn universities into speech policing institutions and put them on collision course, not only with the government, but also, more importantly, with their own student bodies. That, I think, would be a very retrograde step. Now, if there is a conflict between the government and the students, in nearly every case, I'll be on the side of the students. That's very, very clear. Having said that, there may be some instances, and I emphasize some, where restrictions on free speech may be legitimate. So the National Union of Students' no-platform policy, which is supported by nearly 2/3 of students, is very, very, very narrow defined. It encompasses only 6 organizations: far-right extremists and Islamist extremists who are opposed to democracy, human rights, and civil liberties, and who are on record as menacing and threatening people in our society. So that no-platform policy, which I helped campaign for and win in the 1970s, I think that's totally legitimate. I don't think that Islamist extremists or Britain First should have a right to come on campuses and stir hatred against Muslims, Jews, LGBT people, or anybody else. You know, that is, when they use intimidatory tactics, when they threaten and menace the student body, I think that's a red line. I don't think it's permissible. I don't think it's right, because it actually diminishes free speech. If you're a Muslim student and your campus is hosting a far-right, Britain First or National Action speaker, you wouldn't, because these organizations are prescribed, but if you were, you'd feel intimidated. You wouldn't feel safe and secure to come and challenge that, because people from those organizations are on record as physically, violently assaulting Muslim people. So that closes down free speech and open debate. Of course, there have been instances where the no-platform policy has been much more widely interpreted in a very negative way by some student unions and societies. So there was an eventually unsuccessful attempt to ban Nick Lowles, the director of the anti-racist group Hope Not Hate, because he also opposed far-right Islamists. He was unjustly and wrongly branded an anti-Muslim bigot. And there was an attempt, which ultimately failed in the light of national publicity, to get him banned from attending a student event. But the fact there was even this attempt is shocking in itself. Maryam Namazi, an Iranian communist and feminist, a secularist, who has defended Muslim people against the far right, but also fought far-right Islamists who say that gay people should be killed, that Muslims who turn away from the faith should be executed, and so on and so on and so on. she has had several attempts to ban her from speaking at universities. There's a very notorious video of her trying to speak at Goldsmiths College in London. The Islamic Society there tried to get her banned, and when that failed, they disrupted her talk, claiming she was violating the safe space policy. Now, she was not attacking Muslim people at all, but she was critiquing extremist organizations like Hizb ut-Tahrir and so on, who oppose democracy, oppose human rights, and say, for example, if you blaspheme, you should be put to death. And in some cases, their members terrorize fellow Muslims for not conforming to their particular interpretation of Islam. Kate Smurthwaite, the comedian, she also had a run-in with Goldsmiths College. They branded her unfit to speak. The students there branded her unfit to speak because she was critical of sex workers. Now, I don't agree with her stand on sex workers. I defend the rights of sex workers. But she wasn't advocating that sex workers be killed or discriminated against. She just had what I call a rather orthodox feminist view around that issue. But she also was very, very critical of Islamist extremism, and in particular, the many preachers who used to come to universities like this and advocate the killing of blasphemers, apostates, women who have sex outside of marriage, and LGBT people. Now, on that score, she was absolutely right to criticize and call them out. But she eventually was unable to perform. It's a bit complicated, but she was unable to perform at Goldsmiths because of these false allegations made against her. I've also been a victim of several attempted attempts to no platform me on various grounds. One of them was at Christ Church University in Kent in 2016. I wasn't actually no platformed, but what happened was I was invited to speak in an event where the NUS LGBT officer was also invited. And she issued an ultimatum to the university that she wouldn't speak if I was on the platform, accusing me of racism and Islamophobia. When asked to produce the evidence, she couldn't. But anyway, the upshot was the university felt they were being asked to choose between her or me. In the end, they decided they would not give in to her blackmail. I rephrase that, what some people may have interpreted as blackmail. And so I went ahead and spoke with others, and she didn't. But, it is shocking the way in which increasingly we see in some universities completely unfounded allegations being made, and many students uncritically accepting it, that people are racist, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic, and so on. It's quite scary. When the evidence is not produced, even when the evidence is not produced, a surprising number of people go along and apparently believe this nonsense. On the terms of the safe space policy, I think the principle behind a safe space policy is entirely commendable. I think it's absolutely positive that women, racial and gender minorities should not be victimized or overlooked during student meetings and debates. The safe space policy is designed to create an atmosphere where everybody feels able to participate, where all voices can be heard, where meetings are not dominated by straight white men, where minority voices, disabled people, Muslim, black and ethnic minority people, and so on, can be heard with respect. So I'm all in favor of that. But again, sometimes it is much more widely interpreted. So there's a very famous and notorious example happened at Edinburgh University in 2016 when a student, Imogen Wilson, was threatened with rejection from a meeting after she raised her hand and shook her head in disagreement with the speaker. She was told that was a violation of the safe space policy. Under the safe space policy at Edinburgh University, you're not allowed to shake your head or raise your hand while someone's speaking. You're only allowed to nod in approval or clap or jazz hands. Again, that's that is not what the safe space policy was supposed to be about. The policy actually at Edinburgh University explicitly prohibits gestures which denote disagreement. I mean, absurd. So going back to the government's proposals, the big shortcoming in those proposals is that they do not state what the red lines will be. So when the government is saying university authorities have a legal obligation to ensure free speech, they seem to be saying any and all speech. There are no red lines specified. So how is that policy going to be interpreted? Who's going to interpret it? Won't it be subjective? Now, if I was denoting that policy, I'd say there's probably perhaps three main criterion where I think it is legitimate to restrict free speech, to no platform people in three circumstances. First of all, if they are making false, damaging allegations. So if a speaker comes to a campus and critics defame that speaker with false allegations that they're racist, that they're a paedophile, that they're a tax fraudster, that is totally unacceptable. To make false, damaging allegations against someone which could result in real harm to them, that is totally unacceptable, and those kind of people should be no platform. They're not permitted to speak. The second criterion is if someone has a history of being engaged in threat, menaces, or harassment. If they've got in their record that they behave in that kind of way, then again, that's a red line, because that diminishes free speech. People are not going to be confident and able to speak and criticize and challenge a speaker if they're fearful that they will be subjected to harassment, threats, and menaces. And the third and most important criterion is if the speaker has a history of engaging in threats or actual violence. That is a criminal offence. Inciting violence, encouraging or glorifying violence, these are criminal offences under the law. And for speakers, whether they be from far-right organisations like National Action and Britain First, or from Islamist extremist organisations, they should not be given a platform because, again, the threat of violence or a history of violence, and many of these organisations have members with a history of actual physical violence, they should not be rewarded with a platform. So I'd say that those are the three criteria where no platforming can be legitimately restricted. So in the last decade or so, I've helped and campaigned to stop far-right extremists and Islamist extremists from speaking on university campuses. The Islamist extremists, particularly those who advocate killing women who've had sex outside marriage, blasphemers, Muslims who turn away from the faith, and LGBT people. Dozens of them have spoken on university campuses for many years, not now anymore, but until the last 2 or 3 years, they used to speak on university campuses and get away with making these outrageous, inflammatory, threatening, menacing statements. And I have total, absolute moral certainty that I acted right with others to stop them from speaking, because we know that where they spoke, the victims of their speech were intimidated into silence and fear. So I'll just finish with a quote, or not a quote, but a reference to the German communist Rosa Luxemburg, John Stuart Mill, and Mahatma Gandhi, and many others. They all argued that free speech means nothing if it doesn't exist for the person who thinks differently. Students and governments, please take note. Thank you.
Hi again. I actually have 2 questions, but they're fairly short. I'll go through the first one. So one of the things I picked up on was that students are not being critical enough to believing anything. That person's racist, I believe that, for example. How do you think education could play a bigger role in making people more critical? Because I believe with the secondary education system, also in college, teaching to the test, you're kind of taught, you're taught to blindly believe what the teacher tells you in order to get an A star. So my question is, should more emphasis be placed on being critical within secondary education and college?
Answer, most definitely. I mean, some schools do it, but many don't. But I think teaching people about critical thinking, how to evaluate ideas, evidence, and so on, that's very, very important, and more important than ever in this era of fake news that we see the whole social media platforms awash with. Just to give you an example, some of you may know that in 2010, I ambushed the then leader of the British National Party, Nick Griffin, when he was giving a press conference, and challenged him to apologise to the black, Muslim, Jewish and gay communities for the horrendous bigoted views that he and his party espoused. You probably may have seen the video footage where I'm roughed up by his minders and he ran away, didn't have the guts to answer the question. But the upshot was this was so damaging, it caused so much embarrassment to them, that BNP members then orchestrated a campaign to say that I'm a paedophile and encouraging people to take action against me. Take action, well, kill him, beat him up, bomb his house. And these claims and allegations are still circulating in social media even today, 8 years later. And I get death threats all the time of people who believe that I'm a paedophile. And that's a really classic example of how gullible people can be. And I've as far as possible, I try and reply to, I can't reply to them all because there's thousands of them, but I do reply to some people and say, well, what makes you think that I, as a human rights campaigner, would support child sex abuse? That's completely beyond, my whole ethos and the whole life work I've done. And they go, well, it's on this website, and there's all this documentation, all these references, and never mind that they're all made up or they're selective quotations. Like, for example, I have argued in favour of reducing the age of consent, qualifying the age of consent on the basis that, most young people in Britain now have their first sexual experience around the age of 13 or 14. I don't think those young people should be criminalised, which is what the law currently does, providing it's with consent and no one's been harmed and no one's complained. So I've said, let's have an age of consent of 16, but let's not prosecute someone under 16 who has a consenting sexual relationship, providing there's no more than 2 or 3 years difference in their ages. So, a 15-year-old and a 16-year-old, that's okay, but not a 15-year-old and a 40-year-old. Anyway, it's really, really crystal clear in everything I've written, but they selectively cite this as evidence I'm a paedophile. And it is shocking the number of people who, really shocking the number of people who believe this nonsense. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. We need to encourage more critical thinking and people not being so willing to believe something because they've seen it on the internet, or indeed in the mainstream media, because there's stuff in the mainstream media that often or sometimes doesn't bear much relation to the truth.
Wonderful. My second question kind of picks up on a few things you mentioned during the first section. So during the 2016 presidential election in the United States, and there are many other examples, Facebook was one of the key means of fake news being distributed throughout everywhere. And one of the reasons for that was that the algorithm just chose whatever you were most likely to click on, and you're most likely to click on whatever you agree. And that tended to be fake news, outlandish headlines. So should action be taken against Facebook, Instagram, other social networks? Should they be held corporately responsible for abuses of free speech where people have been advocating for things that you would have considered within the threshold for no platforming?
Well, to be fair, it's quite difficult for Facebook to police the billions of things that are uploaded every day. But they can reconfigure their algorithms to identify fake news, perhaps not in every case, but in many cases, and they can be swifter and more effective in taking them down. So I think there's a big responsibility for a very wealthy corporation like Facebook to invest money in ensuring that there are ways to identify and remove fake news, or, for that matter, posts that advocate violence or extreme hate speech. And I don't see why they haven't done that already.
Thanks very much for the speech. I was just going to say, would you support something like a Bill of Rights for free speech, much like they have in the US with the First Amendment? Obviously excluding things you said like defamation and like when it comes to harassment and things like that. But aside from that, would you support something like that?
In principle, yes. And of course, under the Human Rights Act, we already have something very similar. The problem with the US version is that it does allow defamation. People can say completely outlandish, untrue things about other people and get away with it by pleading free speech amendment. So I think that's really dangerous. I think American politics and public discourse is coarsened and diminished by the fact that people can get away with saying very outrageous, untrue, damaging things with legal impunity. I don't think that our libel and defamation laws are right. I think that there's aspects of those that actually diminish free speech, and I'd like to see the libel laws reformed. But I wouldn't like to see a free-for-all like they have in the United States.
And just another quick thing, just leading on from the question before me. Companies like Facebook and Twitter, because they're private companies and they use these algorithms, they have sometimes caught other things in the algorithms that maybe don't fall under these categories. Would you support something like a digital Bill of Rights that's more like what we have at the moment to protect things that are said online and don't necessarily fall under national jurisdiction?
Well, yeah, there is a big campaign for a digital Bill of Rights in this country and many other countries, which is both about safeguarding free speech and stopping state surveillance and state censorship, but also ensuring greater responsibility in terms of what goes on the internet. But again, it's quite difficult to police fairly. So there is a problem there, but I think the principle of the proposed digital Bill of Rights is absolutely correct.
Thank you very much for the talk. You talked a lot earlier about how it's very important that the universities should be allowed to platform or no platform the people who they want. But then when it comes to the social media companies, you said that they need to do a better job at allowing or disallowing people who we don't want. So what is the difference between a university's platform and a social media platform?
Did I say something inconsistent?
Yeah, well, you said that...
I may have, but...
You said that the university's minister's policy around free speech was turning the universities into a speech policing system. But when you talked about the social media platforms, you said that we should tighten the controls on them and enforce certain people off of those platforms.
Yeah, I think the distinction is, when it comes to the universities, I was disagreeing with the university authorities being held liable for the actions of students, individual students or student societies. I thought that was unfair to make the universities responsible, the university authorities responsible for the actions of others. Whereas in the case of Facebook or Twitter, I'm saying, they are platforms, they are providing a platform, and therefore they need to be more circumspect because they have a direct control over that platform.
So the social media companies should be liable, but the universities shouldn't.
The university authorities shouldn't. I don't think that works. But I think the social media companies do need to be responsible and do need to have mechanisms to ensure that the things that they host. So, for example, this meeting isn't being hosted by the university authorities. It's being hosted by Liberate the Debate. Liberate the Debate should be held responsible for what goes on in this meeting. So if I am violently assaulted, they haven't organised that, but if they did organise it, then they should be held responsible. Whereas with the social media platforms, they're not consciously or deliberately, as far as we know, hosting violent threats against X, Y, and Z.
But you said before that we should be able to choose whether we have people on the campus who spread hate speech. But then how do you decipher, because freedom of speech is a very ambiguous thing. If someone comes here to talk about what they believe is truth, then they can also claim that you're infringing on their freedom of speech because they're speaking what they believe we should hear, but because we all have opposing views to it. For example, if they come here speaking about racist or sexist things, but we believe that you said like anything can be taken as offense, how do you then combat against them claiming their freedom of speech to speak about what they want to speak?
Yeah, well, that's why at the end I made the point of those 3 red lines: false, damaging, harmful allegations, threats, menaces, and harassment, and incitements to violence. I agree that hate speech is not one of those 3, and it's very difficult to define because it's subjective. So if, for example, a Christian preacher says that homosexuality is immoral and gay people should repent, I don't like it, but that's their freedom of speech. If they're saying that Christians should go out and beat up gay people, very unlikely, but if they did say that, then that was clearly a threat, an incitement to violence, and they shouldn't be allowed to say that. So that's the distinction I make. But obviously, in my view, as I said, the best way to combat prejudice is by challenging it, producing the counter-evidence, the counter-arguments, and so on, rather than simply suppressing it.
Yeah. And then when you said about defamation, how do you then draw that line between someone spreading lies about someone, rumors, or somebody damaging reputation? Because little lies damage reputation, as well as on big scales with people spreading false news. How do you then draw that line? Because it becomes very vague.
Well, if for example, someone said, they're really rubbish, they were late for a meeting, or they don't treat their girlfriend or boyfriend very well, that's minor. But if they're saying, more substantive damaging stuff, like, for example, I don't know, a government minister is a secret paedophile, then that quite clearly is not only, well, if it's untrue, and if it is untrue, then it's potentially very, very damaging, and could even put that government minister at risk of violent attack by paedophile hunters. So that's where I draw the line. But again, I agree it's a bit subjective.
Yeah, so my question is about sort of the discourse and narrative that's going to be happening, and it'll be between, say you have like Islamic preachers or Islamists, people who want Sharia, and then the LGBT community. So the way I see it, there's going to be, there's obviously the animosity, but both sides are essentially protected with hate speech laws. And what do you think about that? Like because there's going to have to be a discussion about this, like quite openly, because of, lots of Sharia laws and all this. But the fact that both are technically, so if you're criticizing Islam from an LGBT perspective, you're Islamophobe, you could be called Islamophobic, and then on the other side it's homophobic. So what do you see with the coming discourse and how both it's essentially hate speech?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on the language, the tenor, the tone. Those are critical elements to make an assessment. So if any religious fundamentalist says that homosexuality is wrong, that, in my view, is, I'm disappointed, I'm sad, but that's their right. But if they're saying that LGBT people should be denied equal rights, or more seriously, should be killed or threatens them with violence, and I think that crosses the red line. Now, I don't think it is a contradiction, because I'd say the reverse. If an LGBT person said that Muslims should be killed because they're all Islamophobic, A, it's factually incorrect, and B, that would also be an incitement to violence. So I think it works both ways. So in the campaign against Islamist preachers in the last 2 decades, we haven't targeted those preachers who've merely said that homosexuality is wrong. We've only targeted those who have actually effectively said gay people should be put to death, or that women who have sex outside of marriage should be killed. We've said they've crossed that red line. They're talking about killing another human being. So again, it's making a distinction between perhaps offensive, unpalatable, nasty views, and those which actually involve the three criterion: false, damaging allegations, harassment, alarm, or menaces, and also threats to violence. Does that answer it?
Yeah, it's just the way I'm sort of seeing and worrying about it is that at some point there'll just be lots of violence in the street against LGBT people, say where you have people getting attacked, but I just don't know where there's going to be a point where it can just sort of be resolved, really, where the two sides are sort of cohabitating together because of these issues being...
Well, it's true that there have been a number of violent incidents where Islamist extremists have been involved. Like a few years ago, there was a whole series of attacks on LGBT people leaving bars and clubs in the East End of London, where Islamist extremists were shouting, death to sodomites, and you'll burn in hell, and long live Sharia law, and things like that. Very, very clearly, a very clear motivation. And that quite clearly crosses those red lines because it goes into the area of violence. But there was another famous case of a Muslim extremist who put up stickers around East London saying gay-free zone. And most LGBT people called for him to be prosecuted and punished. I didn't. I said, well, obviously I disagree with this, but he wasn't inciting violence. He wasn't threatening or menacing. It was a nasty thing to say, this is a gay-free zone, but it didn't cross those 3 red lines. So I didn't think he should be prosecuted, let alone convicted and punished. I think what he should have done, it would have been very good to have him, to engage in a dialogue with him, to invite him to an LGBT event, or to even, if he wouldn't attend, to actually go and find him and challenge him face to face. That would have been far more effective. And I do know in my own experience, having done that with some Islamist extremists, some of them, not all of them, have had a rethink about their attitudes. And it is very noticeable that among the younger generation of Muslim people in this country, attitudes towards LGBT people and women's rights and so on are much more positive, much more inclusive than the older generation. But there is also a younger generation who are even more homophobic and biphobic and transphobic than the older generation. So, for example, last Friday, my foundation went with LGBT Muslims to the Central London Mosque in Regent's Park, London, to hand out flyers and about LGBT issues. The basic message was LGBT and Muslim people both suffer prejudice, discrimination, and hate crime. We should be working together to protect both communities, that unity and solidarity is the way forward, not by division and animosity, and that in particular, Muslim communities had to accept the reality that there are LGBT Muslims, that they have a valid, legitimate place in the Muslim community. They're not going to go away, they're not going to disappear. And in fact, if you go to London, I'm constantly amazed that if you go into a gay bar or club, this is a bit subjective, but if you look visually at the men in these bars and clubs, you would think that probably maybe 20 or 25% are probably of Muslim heritage. That's pretty enormous. And quite clearly, the Islamists and the Orthodox Muslim preachers are losing the battle because Muslim LGBT people are taking their stand, they're being who they are, they're living their lives, they're not being intimidated anymore. We also, in that leaflet, in our discussions with worshippers, we also made the point that, in fact, nowhere in the Quran does it explicitly condemn homosexuality, and there are certainly no punishments prescribed. And the Quran says it is the complete word of God. It requires no interpretation and no addition. So if you are a strict, genuine Muslim, you should only follow the Quran, not the hadiths or the Sharia law, which are man-made. Now, this obviously provoked quite an animated discussion. But there are some Muslim worshippers who agree with us. They said, yes, we must follow the Quran, and we must recognize that the hadiths and the Sharia law are culturally specific. They arose in particular cultures for particular reasons, but they're not the word of Allah. Interestingly, we only had a few instances of homophobic responses, and they were all from younger people. We had quite a few positive responses, or at least, yeah, I'm going to read this. And they were a mix of younger and older. And then we had 4 people who discreetly came out as LGBT. He whispered in the ear, yeah, I support you, thank you for coming, I'm gay. And they were all sort of mid-20s to mid-30s. So change is happening, and I think, dialogue is the way forward. And it's quite difficult because historically, the mainstream Muslim organisations have been very hostile to women's rights and LGBT rights. And indeed, the Muslim Council of Britain, which is said to be the most representative body of Muslims in this country, even though in fact a poll found that only 4% of Muslims actually think that it represents them, the Muslim Council of Britain from its inception has championed against every single gay law reform. It's linked up with Christian fundamentalists, Judaist fundamentalists and others to oppose all the equality laws of the last 2 decades. So that's really, really sad. It's really sad that a community which itself is victimized would want to victimize another community. But that's our challenge, to point that out and to persuade that community or sections of it that there needs to be a rethink.
Right, well, I think we're just about on time in terms of questions, so please give one final round of applause.
Can also say that if you haven't got one, please take one of my flyers about my foundation. On the back, it tells you how to sign up to receive our email bulletins. They're all free, no charge, so if you want to sign up. We produce a little newsletter every Thursday which covers issues that are often not in the media or not in the mainstream media, usually from minor or LGBT media, but a whole range of issues about human rights questions in Britain and around the world. So feel free to sign up and spread the word. But thank you and good luck with your studies.